Sap cracked in the iron pan as he worked it slow over the coals. Same careful rhythm he used for everything now, nothing rushed, nothing left to chance. The cabin held only what he needed and none of what he'd lost. Then a voice cut through the trees, bright, breathless, talking to no one. A woman stepped into the clearing with a torn map and a smile that didn't match the miles on her boots. She kept speaking as if silence offended her, and for the first time in years. He didn't tell someone to leave. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Sap thickened as it warmed, releasing a faint sweetness that drifted through the cabin and into the cold air beyond the doorway. Elias Boone stood over the iron pan, turning the handle with slow, deliberate care. The motion had long ago become a kind of measure, of time, of control, of the quiet that kept everything in its place. Outside, the trees held still under the weight of late frost, and the sky hung low, pale and unmoving. He listened without meaning to. At first, it was only a distant thread of sound, carried unevenly between the trunks. Not the wind, not an animal, a voice. No, that can't be right, unless the river bends twice. It grew closer, stumbling over itself, talking fast enough to outrun whatever silence followed behind it. Elias did not turn. He had learned the value of stillness, how it kept trouble from finding its way in, but the voice did not pass. It entered. Footsteps crunched over the hard ground just outside his clearing, uneven but determined. Then she appeared. She came through the narrow gap between two pines, brushing past low branches without slowing, her coat worn thin at the elbows and her hat tilted wrong as if she had forgotten it was there. A folded map, split along its creases, hung loosely from one hand. She spoke as she walked, words spilling without pause, as though she feared stopping more than she feared being lost. Well, this must be it, or it should be, unless I've gone entirely the wrong direction, which I suppose is possible. She stopped when she saw him. For a brief moment, the world held. Elias met her gaze, steady and unreadable. Most would have turned away under it. She did not. Her expression shifted, quick surprise, then relief, then something softer, almost amused. "Oh, good," she said, breath catching in the cold. "You're real." He said nothing. She stepped forward anyway, as if silence were only another kind of answer she meant to fill. "I was beginning to think I'd been following the wrong trail for half a day, or longer. It's difficult to tell when everything looks the same." Elias lifted the pan from the coals and set it aside. The movement was careful, controlled. He wiped his hands against a cloth, more out of habit than need. "You're far from the main pass," he said at last. His voice came rough from disuse, low and even. "Yes," she agreed quickly. "I gathered that." The corner of her mouth curved, not mocking, simply honest. "I was meant to reach a settlement by yesterday. I did not." Elias glanced past her toward the tree line. No tracks but her own, no sign of pursuit or company, just the quiet closing in again behind her. "You should turn back," he said. She looked over her shoulder, then back at him. "To where?" He did not answer. The silence stretched, but she did not retreat from it. Instead, she tucked the torn map into her coat and drew a breath that steadied her. "I won't stay long," she said, "just until I know which way not to go." Something in the phrasing, plain, unguarded, lingered in the air. Elias studied her then. Not the words, but the wear in her boots, the way her hands trembled slightly before she stilled them, the faint edge of exhaustion she tried to speak past. He had seen it before, not often, but enough. "You'll freeze before you find your way," he said. She gave a small nod, as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "Then I suppose I'll have to rely on your better judgment." It was not a plea, not quite, more like a quiet wager. Elias turned toward the cabin without another word. She followed. Inside, the warmth held closer, gathered around the low fire and the few pieces of furniture arranged with practical precision. Nothing out of place, nothing unnecessary. She paused just past the threshold, taking it in, not with curiosity alone, but with a kind of careful respect, as though she understood she had stepped into something held together by more than wood and nails. "It's quieter than I expected," she said. Elias moved to the shelf and set the pan down. "It stays that way." She nodded again, softer this time. "I can see why." He poured water into a small pot and set it near the heat. The motions came as they always did, measured, efficient, leaving no room for hesitation. She watched him, then stepped aside, placing herself where she would not interfere. It was not clumsy, not careless. She noticed things. "My name is Lila," she offered after a moment. He did not ask for it. "Elias." The word seemed to settle differently in the room once spoken aloud. "Well," she said lightly, though her voice had gentled, "that's a start." He handed her a tin cup when the water warmed. She accepted it with both hands, holding it close as the heat spread through her fingers. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head once. Outside, the sky darkened sooner than expected. Clouds rolled in low, bringing with them the sharp promise of another cold night, the kind that settled deep into the ground and did not leave easily. Lila noticed it too. She stepped to the doorway, peering out, then drew her coat tighter around herself. "That doesn't look like it plans to pass quickly," she said. "No." She hesitated, just long enough to measure the weight of what she was about to say. "I won't be in your way," she said, "not more than I already am." Elias stood still. He had built this place to hold only himself. Every corner, every object, every hour of the day shaped to keep the past from finding room to return. And yet... He looked at her again, the way she held the cup like it might slip from her if she loosened her grip. The way she stood, ready to move if told, but not retreating unless she had to. "You can stay the night," he said. The words came without force, but they changed something all the same. Relief crossed her face, not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to soften the lines that had been drawn there by miles and uncertainty. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. He gestured toward a spare blanket folded near the wall. "That'll do." She moved to it, careful, as though each step mattered. "I'll make myself useful in the morning," she added, "whatever needs doing." Elias did not answer, but he did not refuse. The fire settled lower, its light steady against the growing dark. Outside, the first edge of snow began to fall, fine, quiet, covering the ground in a slow, even hush. Inside, the silence remained, but it was not the same as before. Lila sat near the wall, wrapped in the blanket, her voice quieter now, speaking only when needed. Elias moved through his routines, the familiar rhythm still there, though something within it had shifted, just enough to be noticed. He had not told her to leave, and as the night closed in around them, that small decision held more weight than either of them yet understood. By the third morning, Lila Redbird no longer moved through Elias Boone's cabin like a guest afraid of touching the wrong thing. She had begun, first, with the smallest adjustments. A kettle set closer to the hearth before dawn, so the water would warm without being asked. A split seam in one of his wool shirts, mended with tight, neat stitches he only noticed when he pulled it over his shoulders, and found the tear gone. The wood shavings he swept from his bench no longer gathered in a sad little drift by the wall because she had worked out where he kept the broom and used it before he came back in from the shed. None of it was grand. That was what made it difficult to resist. Elias returned from checking his trap line one afternoon to find her crouched beside a broken snowshoe frame, her coat tucked under her legs, a strip of softened rawhide looped through the wood with patient fingers. She had spread his tools on a folded cloth and arranged them by size as though they belonged there. He stopped in the doorway and watched without speaking. She glanced up. "I asked the snowshoe whether it wished to remain broken," she said. "It offered no objection to repair." "That's my good all. I know, I borrowed it respectfully." He stepped inside, set down the rabbits he had brought in, and took the frame from her hands. The lacing was not perfect, but it was firm and clean. "Who taught you?" "My uncle fixed everything twice," she said. "Once when it broke, and once because he did not trust the first repair. I watched often enough." Elias turned the frame over. "This'll hold." Something like satisfaction flickered across her face, quick and quiet. "I was hoping it might." He handed it back, and their fingers brushed for less than a breath. She did not draw attention to it. Neither did he. That afternoon, she asked to walk part of the lower trail with him the next day. He nearly refused before the words reached his mouth. The mountains were no place for someone still learning their turns, but Leela had a way of standing her ground without making a contest of it. "I am tired of staring at the same four walls," she said, wrapping dried meat in cloth for the journey as if the matter were already settled. "And if I'm to stop being a nuisance, I ought to know where not to step." "You haven't been a nuisance." The answer came too quickly. He felt it the moment it left him. She paused, a square of linen in one hand, and looked at him with such open surprise that he turned to the shelf before she could make anything of it. "That may be the kindest thing you've said to me," she replied softly. He busied himself with his gear while she smiled to herself and let the remark stand. The trail down to the settlement wound between dark pines and patches of old ice that survived in the shadows. Leela walked carefully at first, but not fearfully. She asked questions, not the empty kind meant only to fill silence, but the sort that came from observing. Why the bark was peeled from certain trees. Why he marked one stone with charcoal and not another. Why he moved uphill around wind-fallen timber instead of stepping over it. Elias answered when he chose. She accepted what he gave and did not pull at what he kept. Near midday they reached the edge of Ash Creek, a settlement of a few weathered buildings gathered around the general store, a blacksmith shed, and a church that leaned slightly to one side as though tired of enduring winters. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog slept beneath a wagon. A pair of boys ran past with sticks in hand, playing at cavalry and forgetting the cold. Heads turned when Elias entered town. They always did. He was known there, though not often seen. The man from the upper timber. The widower who came down for flour, salt, and lamp oil spoke only when required and left before conversation could settle on him. This time he was not alone. Mrs. Bell, who kept the store with a practical eye and an apron that never stayed clean, stood behind the counter weighing coffee beans. She saw Leela first and raised both brows. "Well," she said, looking from one to the other, "either winter has grown stranger than I imagined, or Elias Boone has finally brought company." Leela stepped forward before Elias could harden under the attention. "I assure you," she said, "I arrived through misfortune rather than invitation." Mrs. Bell barked out a laugh, Then you may be the first person in years to speak honestly on this floorboards. Her gaze softened. You need anything? Leela glanced around the store. Bolts of cloth, lamp chimneys, sacks of beans, jars of nails, peppermint sticks in a cloudy glass jar. Her eyes rested briefly on a stack of slate boards and a basket of darning needles. I can sew, she said, and mend if anyone has work. Mrs. Bell wiped her hands on her apron. Half this town has work. Most of it's just waiting on someone steady enough to do it. That was how it began. By the end of the week, Leela had taken in 2 bundles of mending from the Bell household, patched a torn curtain at the church, and helped old Mr. Corley sort the accounts in his feed shed because, as she explained to Elias later, figures made sense when people did not. She had a way with those who felt overlooked. Widows spoke to her while she pinned hems. Children lingered near her because she listened to their nonsense as though it mattered. Even the blacksmith's wife, who trusted no one with gossip or soup recipes, sent her home with warm bread and the promise of more sewing if she wanted it. Elias saw these things without being told. He noticed how people greeted her by name before they saw him standing nearby. He noticed how she carried herself differently now, not less gentle, but less uncertain. Her shoulders had straightened. Her laughter came easier. She moved through Ash Creek as though she might, one day, belong somewhere again. It should have eased him. In one way, it did. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that he liked hearing the details when they returned home. Mrs. Bell's cat stealing sausage from the back shelf. Mr. Corley insisting his missing spectacles had been stolen by Providence, only to discover them in his hat lining. The church curtain refusing to hang straight because the building itself was crooked. Leela told such things while peeling potatoes or folding washed cloth, and Elias, who had once considered conversation a burden no different from wet firewood, began to wait for them. One evening, as dusk pressed blue against the cabin windows, she set a stew to simmer with onions, rabbit, and the last of the turnips from his root box. Elias sat at the table repairing a leather strap while she moved around the hearth with her sleeves rolled and a faint smear of flour at her wrist. "You are quieter tonight," she said. He looked up. "You usually do enough talking for both of us." She turned, wooden spoon in hand, and narrowed her eyes in mock offense. That sounded suspiciously like teasing. It sounded like truth. She stared at him for half a beat, then laughed, full and warm, surprised out of herself. Elias felt the sound land in the room and stay there. He had not meant to make her laugh, that was the trouble. She came closer to set his bowl before him, and as she leaned, a loose strand of hair slipped from behind her ear. Without thinking, he reached to catch the bowl at the same moment she adjusted her grip. His hand closed over hers. Neither moved. Her skin was warm from the stove. The contact was simple, accidental, but it struck him with an intimacy he had not prepared for. Leela's gaze lifted to his. Her mouth parted slightly, not in fear, not in invitation, only in startled stillness. Elias drew back first, too quickly. The spoon knocked softly against the rim. She steadied the bowl and stepped away with more care than before. "Supper will cool," she said. "Yes." He bent over the strap again, though the stitching blurred beneath his fingers. Across from him, Leela sat down and kept her eyes on her meal. She spoke no more than necessary that night. The next morning he rose before dawn and took the long ridge line alone. He stayed out too many hours, longer than the traps required, longer than the weather advised. He walked because the old restlessness had returned, the kind that made a man feel hunted by memory even when no sound followed him. Snow gave under his boots, in thin layers. Crows lifted from a dead pine and scattered black across the pale sky. When he came back, the cabin was warm. His gloves had been laid near the hearth to dry. A plate waited under a cloth. Layla looked up from the table where she was sorting mended garments into neat stacks. She did not ask where he had been. She only said, "You forgot your lunch." He removed his coat slowly. "I wasn't hungry." "That was foolish. I've been called worse." A tiny smile touched her mouth but did not settle. "I imagine you have." He stood there a moment longer than made sense. Mrs. Bell paying fare. For sewing, fair enough. She tied off a bundle with twine. She says I work quickly and keep my thoughts to myself. That second part's a lie. This time the smile held. I save the better thoughts for home. The word struck him more sharply than if she had meant to. Home. He turned away under the weight of it. She noticed. Of course she noticed, but she let him move through the silence without crowding him. 2 days later, his brother Nathan came up from the valley with a sack of winter apples and the blunt patience of a man who had spent years talking to someone determined not to answer. Nathan was broader in the shoulders than Elias, less carved by solitude, with a wife in town and 3 children who had inherited his habit of asking questions no one could evade. He stomped snow from his boots and stopped just inside the door when he saw Leela bent over the wash basin wringing out a shirt. "Well now," Nathan said. "This explains why my brother didn't look half dead the last time I saw him." Elia's face set at once. "You came to deliver apples, not opinions." Nathan grinned. "I brought both." Leela hid a smile and introduced herself. Nathan, unlike Elias, filled space easily. Within minutes he had drawn from her the story of how she had lost the main pass, what work she had found in Ash Creek, and how Elias apparently believed all meals could be improved by refusing to season them. "That true?" Nathan asked. Elias took the sack from him. "You planning to stay long?" "Long enough." Nathan's gaze moved only once between Elias and the room, the extra cup drying beside the basin, the folded shawl on the chair, the stove blacked from more frequent use. "Looks different in here." "Oh, it's cleaner," Leela said. Nathan laughed aloud. After dinner, while Leela stepped outside to shake crumbs from the cloth and gather more wood from the stack, Nathan stood near the hearth warming his hands. He waited until the door closed behind her before speaking. "You going to tell me what you're doing?" he asked. "Living." "That ain't what I asked." Elias placed the apples in a crate with unnecessary care. She needed shelter. "And now?" The room seemed to narrow. Elias kept his eyes on the crate. "Now she works in town and leaves when the roads open enough." Nathan nodded slowly. "That what you want?" Elias did not answer. Nathan had always been the one person who could step close to the truth without raising his voice. "You look at her," he said, "like a starving man trying to remember whether he's allowed to eat." Elias' jaw tightened. "Watch yourself." "I am watching you." Nathan lowered his tone. "For 3 years you've spoken to no one unless the sky fell or a mule broke a leg. Now I walk in here and the place sounds lived in again. You got bread warm on the stove and someone humming while she works. Don't tell me that means nothing." "It doesn't change what's gone." "No," Nathan said, "it does." That was the cruelty of it, and the mercy too. Elias turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, Leela stood by the woodpile, her breath pale in the evening air. She had tucked her skirt up from the snow and was trying to carry too much at once. A log slipped. She caught it with her knee and laughed at herself, looking around as though the trees might have seen. Something in his chest gave a hard, quiet pull. Nathan followed his gaze. "Mary wouldn't ask you to freeze beside her memory," he said. The words landed like a blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were spoken gently. Elias shut his eyes. Mary, he had trained himself not to say her name unless forced. A name could turn a room dangerous. Bring back the curve of a hand on a blanket, the small cough of a child in fever, the stillness after. Winter had taken them both in less than a week. A coughing sickness, then snow too deep to fetch help in time. He had kept the fire going. He had boiled water until his hands blistered. He had prayed after he stopped believing prayer would do anything. None of it had mattered. When he opened his eyes again, the woodpile beyond the window had blurred. "She was all I had," he said, and the words sounded torn loose from somewhere buried deep. Nathan did not move. "I know." Elias braced one hand on the sill. If I look at this for what it is," he swallowed hard, "then I lose it too, that's how it goes." Nathan took a slow breath. "Maybe, or maybe grief lied to you so long you call it wisdom." The latch lifted. Leela stepped back inside with her arms full of wood. The brothers said nothing more, but the silence had changed shape. That night, long after Nathan left for town and the fire burned low, Elias sat awake on the bench by the wall while Leela slept beneath her blanket near the hearth. Moonlight silvered the edge of her face. One hand rested open against the floorboards, as if even in sleep she trusted the space around her. He had forgotten what trust looked like. Near dawn, a storm rolled down from the north. Not a wild blizzard, but a hard, steady fall that sealed the world in white and pressed the cabin closer around those inside it. Leela woke coughing from the chill and tried to hide it by turning away. Elias heard it anyway. "You're cold." "I am attempting not to complain." He stirred the fire and brought another blanket. When he draped it over her shoulders, she looked up, surprised by the nearness. "You do notice more than you admit," she murmured. He might have stepped back then, might have let the moment pass as he had before, but the night with Nathan still worked at him like a splinter. Layla studied his face in the dim light. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Your brother spoke to you, then you looked as though something old came back." He sat down on the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, hands hanging between them. For a long while he said nothing. The storm brushed at the roof. A log shifted in the stove. Finally he said, "I had a wife." She did not interrupt. "And a little girl." His voice thinned on the last two words. "One winter, sickness took both before the thaw." Leela lowered her eyes, not from discomfort, but from respect. He kept going because stopping seemed harder. "I kept thinking if I moved quickly enough, if I did every small thing right, I could hold the line against it." He let out a breath that shook. "Afterward, I stopped trusting anything I could not control, people least of all." The room remained still except for the storm. Layla's fingers tightened slightly in the blanket. "That is a terrible thing to survive." He laughed once, without humor. "Survive isn't the right word." She looked at him then, and there was no pity in her face. Only grief meeting grief without flinching. "My mother used to speak when she was frightened," she said. "Constantly. My father would tease her for it. Then soldiers came through near our winter camp one year, and we were scattered for days before we found one another again. After that, when silence grew too large, she talked so she would know she was still here. Leela smiled faintly, but her eyes shone. I suppose I learned the habit honestly. Elias bent his head. Something within him, wound tight for years, loosened all at once. He did not mean to break. Men like him rarely chose the moment. It came the way a thaw comes to river ice, quiet, then all at once too much. His shoulders bowed. He pressed a hand hard over his mouth as if he could stop it there, but the grief came through anyway, raw and helpless and old, not loud. That made it harder to bear. A man trying and failing to contain what had waited too long. Leela moved from her bedding to the space beside his chair and sat on the floor near his knees. She did not touch him immediately. She only stayed, letting him know he was not alone in the room with it. When at last his hand fell away and he covered his eyes, she placed her fingers lightly against his wrist. "You loved them," she said. The truth of it undid him more than comfort could have. He wept then, not as a young man, not as a husband, not even as the mountain trapper the town kept at a distance, just as a man too tired to keep carrying the dead by himself. Outside, snow kept falling, soft and relentless. Inside, Leela remained beside him until the storm and the dark within him began at last to ease. The morning after the storm passed came with a stillness that felt newly made. Snow lay smooth across the clearing, untouched, except for the faint path between the cabin and the woodpile. The sky held a clean blue that only followed hard weather, and the air carried that sharp, waking cold that made every breath feel like the first. Inside, the cabin had changed again, not in its walls or structure. Those remained as they always had, sturdy, practical, worn by seasons. But something quieter had shifted, something that could not be seen directly. The kind of change that lived in the space between movements, in the way two people crossed a room without colliding, in the way silence no longer pressed quite so hard. Elias rose early, though not before Leela this time. She was already at the hearth, kneeling close to the coals, coaxing the fire back to life with careful breaths. The soft crackle of kindling filled the room. She did not turn when he sat up, but she spoke, voice low so as not to startle the morning. "You slept." It was not a question. He ran a hand over his face, rough with stubble. "Some. That is more than before." He did not argue. She rose, brushing ash from her palms, and set a kettle on the hook. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet that followed did not feel empty, but it was different. Something had been said between them the night before that could not be folded away again. Grief once named did not return easily to silence. Elias moved to the table, his hands lingering on the edge as though steadying himself. "You should go into town today," he said after a while. "Mrs. Bell will be waiting on that sewing." Leela nodded. "I planned to." She hesitated, then added, "You don't have to come." "I know." The words settled heavier than they should have. She turned slightly toward him, studying his face, not searching, not pressing, only observing the way one did when something mattered. "You always go with me," she said. "Not always." "Enough." He looked away. Outside, the snow reflected light so brightly it forced the eyes to narrow. He watched it through the small window as though it might offer him something clear and uncomplicated. "I've things to tend here," he said. It was true, but not the whole of it. Leela did not challenge him. She only tied her shawl more securely around her shoulders and gathered the small bundle of mended garments she intended to deliver. "I won't be long," she said. He nodded. When she stepped out into the cold, the door closed softly behind her. Elias stood where he was, listening to the fading crunch of her steps until the forest took the sound and gave nothing back. The cabin felt larger without her, not emptier. That would have been easier to accept. Larger, as if space had opened up in places he had forgotten existed. He set about his work with more force than needed, splitting wood that did not require splitting, sharpening tools that held their edge well enough. The rhythm did not settle him as it once had. It felt off, misaligned with something he could not name. By midday, the sun had climbed high and the clearing lay bright and untouched. Elias stepped outside, drawn not by purpose but by restlessness. He walked as far as the ridge that overlooked the lower trail. From there, the path toward Ash Creek cut through the trees in a narrow line, marked only by subtle shifts in snow and shadow. He could not see the town from that distance, but he knew where it lay. He stood there longer than he meant to, then turned back. Leela returned in the late afternoon, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her arms full of small things, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a bundle of thread, a small tin of something that smelled faintly sweet. "You did not come down," she said, stepping inside. "No." She set her things on the table. "Mrs. Bell asked after you. She said the last time she saw you, you looked less like a man waiting for winter to end and more like one waiting for supper." Elias made a non-committal sound. Leela unwrapped the bread, breaking off a piece and handing it to him before he could refuse. She also said, "If you do not come by soon, she will come up here herself and inspect the condition of your pantry." "That would be unwise." She did not sound deterred. A corner of his mouth shifted barely. Leela watched him, catching it. "There," she said quietly, "that." He frowned slightly. "What?" "That small thing you do when you almost smile, but decide against it." "I don't decide." "You do," she said gently. "You simply do it quickly." He turned away, reaching for the kettle, as if it required immediate attention. They moved around each other in the space with a care that had not been there before, not distance, not avoidance, but an awareness sharpened by what had passed between them. Days followed in a pattern that held both closeness and restraint. Leela continued her work in Ash Creek, growing more certain with each passing day. She took on additional sewing, began helping Mrs. Bell with small tasks behind the counter, and even spent an afternoon teaching two of the town children their letters using chalk and a slate she had purchased with her earnings. She returned each evening with stories, though she told them differently now, less to fill silence, more to share something that belonged to both of them. Elias listened. Sometimes he asked questions. That alone marked a change the town would have found difficult to believe. Yet, for all the quiet progress, something held back between them. It lived in the pauses, in the moments where one might have spoken and chose not to, in the way Elias no longer avoided her presence, yet did not step fully into it either, in the way Leela watched him sometimes, as though waiting for something she would not demand. One evening, as the light faded early behind a low bank of cloud, Leela stood near the window folding a length of cloth. "The road will open soon," she said, not looking at him. Elias stilled. Snow did not last forever in these mountains. It thinned, retreated, gave way to mud and running water. Travelers began to move again. Paths became choices rather than barriers. He knew this. "Yes," he said. She folded the cloth again, slower. "There are places I could go." He waited. "Further west, perhaps," she continued, "or south, where the winters are not so insistent." "And you want that?" She paused, then turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "I want not to be where I am not wanted." The words were simple, their weight was not. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. "You're not." He stopped, not what, not unwanted, not temporary, not something that would leave no mark when gone. He did not know how to finish the thought without unraveling something he had only just begun to hold together. Leela gave a small nod, as though she had heard what he had not said. "I know," she replied quietly. "You have given me more than I expected when I first walked into your clearing." That was not what he meant, but it was all he had offered. The days that followed carried a subtle distance, not coldness, not rejection, but a careful stepping around something that both of them felt and neither had yet named. Elias found himself watching her more. The way she worked, the way she spoke with quiet confidence now, the way her presence filled the cabin not with noise, but with life. He noticed how the place had changed. The shelf near the window now held small things that had no strict purpose, but remained all the same. A smooth stone, a length of ribbon, a folded piece of paper with careful writing. The table bore the marks of shared meals, not solitary ones. The air itself felt warmer even before the fire was lit. And still he hesitated. The fear had not left him. It sat beneath everything, patient and unyielding. If he allowed himself to reach for this, to claim it, to hold it as something real, then he would be opening a door he had sealed with great effort. And what lay beyond that door was not only warmth, it was loss, it was memory, it was the knowledge that anything gained could be taken again. One afternoon, as the snow began to soften under a weak sun, Elias stood outside splitting wood when he heard her call from the edge of the clearing. "Elias, wait." He turned. She was hurrying toward him, breath quick, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. There was something in her expression he had not seen before, something urgent, uncertain. "I need to speak with you," she said. He set the axe aside. "What is it?" She slowed as she reached him, drawing a steadying breath. For a moment, she looked as though she might retreat into easier words, but she did not. "I've been offered work," she said, "longer term, in town." Elias felt the ground shift beneath him, though he did not move. "That's good." "Yes," she said, "it is." Silence stretched between them. "I would have a place to stay," she continued. "Mrs. Bell has a room. It's small but warm." He nodded once. "And you want that?" She held his gaze. "I want to know if I am leaving something behind that matters." The question settled between them, clear and unavoidable. Elias looked at her then, not as someone passing through his life, not as a temporary presence shaped by circumstance, but as she was. Someone who had stepped into his silence and refused to be turned away. Someone who had made a place where none had existed. Someone who had brought warmth into a life he had believed would remain cold. His throat tightened. "You matter," he said. It was not enough. She waited. He felt the weight of everything he had not said pressing forward, demanding voice. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Do what?" This feeling, the word came slow, unfamiliar, letting something grow again. Her expression softened, but she did not step closer. "You are already doing it," she said. "That's what frightens me." The truth of it left him exposed in a way he had not been since the night of the storm. Leela's eyes held his, steady and warm. "Fear does not mean you are wrong," she said. "It means you care enough to risk losing." He drew a breath that did not quite steady him. "I lost everything once," he said. "I don't know if I can." "You are not betraying them," she said gently, "by choosing to live again." The words struck deep, echoing something Nathan had said, something Elias had not been ready to hear. "And if I lose this too?" he asked. "Then you will have had it," she replied, "and that is not nothing." Silence followed. The trees stood still around them. The snow softened underfoot. Somewhere in the distance, water began to move beneath ice. Elias stepped forward, not quickly. Not with certainty, but with enough intention that the distance between them closed. "I don't want you to go," he said. The words settled into the space between them, simple and unadorned. Leela's breath caught just slightly. "Then don't ask me to," she replied. He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation. Her fingers closed around his. For a moment they stood there, the world narrowing to the quiet connection between them. Then slowly he drew her closer. There was no rush, no urgency, only a careful recognition of something that had already taken root. When he kissed her, it was not with the force of a man claiming something new, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had found something he thought lost. She returned it with equal steadiness. No more, no less. The moment passed, but it did not vanish. It remained, settling into the space between them as something real. Spring came slowly to the mountains. Snow receded in uneven patches, revealing ground that had waited patiently beneath it. Water ran clearer in the creek. The air softened, carrying with it the faint promise of growth. Layla did not leave. She moved her small bundle of belongings fully into the cabin, not as a guest, but as someone who had chosen to stay. The changes that followed were not sudden, but they were steady. They worked together. Shared meals became habit rather than exception. Elias found himself speaking more without needing to be drawn out. Leela continued her work in town, walking the trail with confidence now, sometimes alone, sometimes with him. The cabin changed. Not in structure, but in spirit. A second chair was built at the table. The shelves held more than tools and provisions. Light seemed to linger longer in the evenings. Elias no longer avoided the ridge that overlooked the trail. Sometimes he stood there simply to watch the path, not with dread, but with expectation. Months passed. Summer came, then turned. By autumn, the cabin no longer felt like a place that had once held grief. It felt like a place that held life. The day they married was simple. No grand gathering, no formal ceremony, just a small group in Ash Creek, the church standing a little less crooked than before, and Mrs. Bell wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron while pretending she was not. Elias spoke few words. But the ones he did speak carried everything that mattered. Years later, the cabin still stood, stronger in some ways, softer in others. A small child's laughter could be heard from within, bright and unguarded. Leela's voice followed, steady and warm. Elias stood at the doorway, watching them, the weight he once carried no longer pressing him down. The past had not vanished, but it no longer held him in place. He stepped inside, and the door this time closed not against the world, but around a life he had chosen to live again. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So, till we meet again. Friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.